Talking about enzymes today. Okay, so first we're not going to cover everything on my papers here. We'll do what we can. Okay, what is an enzyme? First, just what is an enzyme? So there's lots of chemical and biological processes that would happen by themselves. They just take so long that they're just not meaningful. It won't help anybody. Like the food that you eat would eventually break down to the point that you could get nutrition out of it by itself. But by the time that happened, there wouldn't be anybody left to get the nutrition. So it would take so long that it's ridiculous. It's not helpful. So the enzyme speeds up the process. That's what enzymes do. They speed up processes that might happen by themselves, and they make them happen like way faster, so that you eat your food, your body gives off enzymes in your mouth and in your stomach and in your throat, all different kinds of places, and they what we call, they digest the food. So they help the food, that process that might have happened, they break the thing that, in this case, usually it breaks the thing down in so quickly that now you could get something out of it. Now you're eating a piece of cake, and the nutrition from that thing gets into your bloodstream, and you could make something out of it.
An enzyme is only an accelerator. It doesn't.
Correct.
You said the word might have happened.
As a rule,
it couldn't have happened on its own. Can an enzyme do it?
I don't think so. I think I might be wrong. My impression is that it's for something that would happen by itself, but I might be wrong about that. Okay, it's for sure usually like that.
How does that go?
No, I didn't say that.
What if it
Okay.
happens on its own, but slow?
Okay, so now every enzyme is also very, very particular to the thing that it's going to work on. So, like an example, you can show you the pictures. Okay, here are two enzymes. Okay, on the left one is alpha amylase, and of course you all know that. And the left one is rennet. The picture is not so great, and it's made up of in the rennet. What I read is made of 323 proteins. Okay, it's made into a very, and its shape is unique. As you could see, the shapes are very particular, and that helps it connect to this specific item. And because of that, it has its special effect. Like, for example, just as an example, for what it's worth, you may have heard something called olestra. Olestra was a fat that didn't give you any calories, okay? So they made like potato chips out of it with olestra instead of with regular fat, and all of a sudden didn't have any calories. And the reason is because they changed the shape of the molecule. How is not important. They changed the shape of the molecule in a certain way that now the enzyme that breaks down fat in your body couldn't work on it. So it tasted like it had the taste of fat, but your body couldn't digest it. Now, it had all kinds of problems that having undigested fat passing through your system that made it very unpopular for people who didn't like what it did to them, stomach-wise. But as far as calorie-wise, you had no calories because your body couldn't break it down. So it couldn't get into your bloodstream. It didn't give you any nutrition or fat. Okay, that's just an example of that. Okay, so
So when does it look like this? On a microscope?
Yeah, it probably doesn't really look like that. That's what a scientist thinks that looks like. It does have a very unusual shape. It's the shape that makes the difference.
It looks like that? I don't know, it's silly.
This is like an artist rendition type of thing.
Yeah. This is not. I didn't take a picture of this in my office. No. Okay. So okay now, the for our purposes, we divide our main enzymes that we're going to talk about are fit into three groups. But I'll show you some things here, and I want to explain to you the naming of how it works. So lipase is an enzyme that works on lipids. Okay, the three are going to come here, and it's called lipase. Get it? Because it works on lipids, fats. Okay, proteases work on proteins, and amylases work on starch. Of course, it's not called starchy H's because amylum is a Latin word. Okay, so the typical way you name a enzyme is based on what it does. Ace is at the end based on what it does, and these three are the ones that are the most relevant to people like for food work use. But sometimes they don't follow the rules, okay? And sometimes it has a name based on where it comes from. So like papain is because it comes from papaya, and fish, I don't know if I pronounce that right, fish, however you pronounce it, comes from figs, okay? And sometimes the older style, the not official way, is to use, instead of at the end ace, is to use in at the end, okay? So pancreatin comes from a pancreas, okay? It's an enzyme that comes from a pancreas, but instead of being pancreatase, it's called pancreatin. Okay, kacha.
That fits in.
What'd you say?
That fits in one.
Right, correct. So sometimes it uses the old, it's like an older style or not official style. Okay, not so important. Okay, now there are some enzymes that come from plant materials, like some of the ones that you just saw, and here's some other ones. Okay, like these other ones, barley beta amylase comes from barley, like pretty good way to guess where that comes from. So these ones that come from plant ones are not so kashrus sensitive. We've talked about on the first two, on the first one, papaya and pineapple, are low shilos, but that kashrus wise usually not so sensitive. There are other ones that are made through fermentation, and those are meant to copy ones that are found in the wild. So, like there's something called chymosin. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, which is the way you make rennet through fermentation. Okay, so it's called chymosin. They call it chymosin. Okay, so that means rennet is something that's found in an animal's body. And we could talk about that more the rest of today. It's made in an animal's body. You want to make a copy of that? They make this artificial one, and they make it through a fermentation. Those also are not particularly kosher sensitive, except that they're made by fermentation. So fermentations always have the regular kosher sensitivity, but nothing horribly, problematic from those. Okay. The one that the biggest kashrus concerns are the ones that we're going to spend most of our time today talking about, and that is the ones that are made from animals. Okay. Okay. So, and that's going to spend most of my time. But before I get to that, I wanted to show you 8 common enzymes. I told you 3 groups, 8 common enzymes, and what they do or what they're for, and then I doubt we're going to have time, but if we do, at the end, I'm going to tell you how their halachic status, so to speak. Okay, whether they're Davar Hama'amid. Okay, the first is amylases. Okay, amylases work on starches. So there's like alpha amylase and beta amylase. There's invertases, different ones that work on starches, and they break them down. Like if you want to make an alcoholic beverage out of wheat or out of barley. So barley itself, the yeast can't do anything to wheat, just like you can't do anything with wheat. If you stick wheat into your blood, it's not going to do any good. You're not going to get any nutrition from it. So the amylase breaks it down into sugars, into smaller parts, and then the yeast can do its thing and turn it into alcohol. Okay, that's what amylase is. Okay, the next one is called dextrinase. And that's used commonly when you make sugar. So some of the sugar, there'll be sugar molecules will group together into something called dextrin, okay, and it clogs up the machinery. So they use dextrinase to break that stuff apart, so the stuff just works through the machinery better. Okay, it's a Pesach question.
It's not to speed up. It has a different
It is. It's a speed. The dextrin by itself would eventually break down. In theory, it would eventually break down. By using this stuff, it breaks down quickly, fast enough that we could process the sugar. We can't wait 1,000 years for it to happen, so we just break it down. It just keeps the machinery going. It's not because it doesn't help, so to speak, for the sugar per se. Turns it back into sugar. Okay. Next, glucose isomerase. This is an important one that people use, and that is when you take corn and turns it into corn syrup. Right. So if in your house you have corn syrup, so the ratio of this more glucose than fructose in that corn syrup. The starch is a lot of sugars together, and we break it down it turns into corn syrup. So it has different sugars, and some sugars are glucose and some are fructose. Okay, there's more in regular corn syrup. There's more glucose than there is fructose. Okay, well, fructose is sweeter. So if you want to use corn syrup to make it really sweet like sugar, you want to have more fructose. You want to make high fructose corn syrup. You want to take fructose, it's the ratio of glucose to fructose should be changed. It's like you might see, it'll say 55-45. You're changing the ratio of fructose to glucose, and glucose isomerase does that shit.
Are just the ratio.
The percentage of glucose to fructose. And that has to do with the sweetness. That relates to the sweetness of the product you're going to have. If you want to put it into your Pepsi, you want to put high fructose. You want a lot of fructose, more fructose relative to glucose. So glucose isomerase is what changes the ratio from one to the other.
So why not just take all fructose? Why do you have to have any glucose?
You could get fructose, but you have to go to some other source. Excuse me. You can't. Corn doesn't have fructose in it, so you have to turn it first to the corn syrup, then use the glucose isomerase to switch some of those molecules around to be more fructosey than glucosey, whatever. Okay. Next, lactase, and that is the sugar in milk. The sugar in milk is called lactose. OSE usually means sugar. It means it's the sugar that's in milk, and lactase digests that sugar, which helps some people who can't digest themselves. Okay, so then they don't have to. Their body doesn't have to digest the sugar because they're missing that enzyme.
What does it turn it into?
What does it turn it into? I don't remember. I don't know what it does to it. I think, if I remember correctly, lactose is a disaccharide. It has two sugar molecules. It has two molecules. It's two molecules put together, and it breaks them apart. Now they're just two sugar molecules. I forgot which sugars they are, but 2 sugar. I think if I remember
The sugar's
correctly.
still there. It's got sugar in it, but it doesn't.
Yeah, no. But
Lactose.
the word sugar is a very vague, non-scientific word. It's a disaccharide, and then this breaks it apart into 2 individual
People
sugars.
are lactose intolerant can digest whatever breaks it into.
Right, correct.
It's the same calories.
Yeah, it doesn't make a difference. Yeah. Okay, and then lipase. I mentioned before that it digests fats. It's commonly used in butter, where if it makes the fat in the butter have this rancid taste to it, and you think that's negative, but your body doesn't think so, because when you taste it, you can't eat lipolyzed butter that's had this lipase effect to it. It's really awful tasting. But when you mix some of that into regular butter, it gives overall a good taste to it. Okay, butter that
It's like the chelbina.
is maybe.
Chelbina is the best.
Yes, maybe. But no, the idea is that people eating very, very fresh butter, it seems, the best quality butter doesn't taste as good, and you need a little of it to turn rancid in order to make it taste good. Kacha. Okay, we're really good. We're never going to make it through, but I'll do what I can. I'm sorry. Okay, papain comes papaya. It's a meat tenderizer. Okay, it's easy. Pectinase, as you could guess, it breaks apart pectin. So if you have juice that has pectin as a protein, a starch floating around inside of the juice, it makes the juice look cloudy. Doesn't look so good. So you use pectinase, breaks apart that pectin, and it makes the juice clearer. Okay, and you could also use it to get more juice out of your fruit. If some of the juice is stuck in as starch, you break apart the pectin, and it gets more. You get a better yield out of your juice, out of your fruits, than you would otherwise. And then, last but not least, these are in alphabetical order. If you haven't realized, last but not least is rennet, which you put into milk, and it turns it into cheese. Okay, really, what it's doing is it's affecting the kappa casein, one of the casein molecules, and by changing the way it functions, it helps the fat and the protein really and the fat separate. They float to the top, and now you've created cheese. Okay, you didn't create something. You separated the parts that were in the milk by themselves into there's a bunch of names for these different caseins. You separate them apart, and then the stuff gets left behind. Okay. Speak. Okay. Enough for slides for a while now. Okay, you can look at that if you want. Okay, so let's talk about now the animal enzymes. That's our big issue. There are 2 important ones that we're going to talk about because of what happens with them, and they are lipase and rennet. Lipase is found in the throat of cows, goats, or sheep. For your curiosity, if you know Shrita-wise, it's in the shipui kaiva. It's part of the throat of these animals, and it's a lipase, so it's good to breaking down lipids, fats, and particularly I mentioned a minute ago, it's used for making lipolyzed butter or for making enzyme modified cheese. All these ideas, it breaks down the fat that's in there in a way that is considered to be positive and makes it taste better. And the other one is rennet, and that comes from the natural place to find it from is in the 4th stomach. It's called the cava or the abomasum, the 4th stomach of a cow. And its use in the animal is for the same thing. It breaks apart the milk. It breaks apart the parts of the milk so the animal can digest it better, particularly in young calves. It's a protease. It means it attacks protein. And we use it to make cheese. If you take that stuff, just like it in the cow's stomach, it turns the milk, it breaks down the milk. So for us also, it breaks it down into what we call cheese and what's left over, what's called the weight left over. Okay? Those are the 2 ones. Now, most companies that make kosher cheese, the kosher cheese that you eat, don't use rennet from a cow. And the ones who want to eat, the butter that you have in your house probably doesn't use lipase. Yeah, everybody. The lipase that you eat doesn't. So the lipase that you eat doesn't come from animals' throats. It comes from copies of it. I told you, they're made by fermentation. Okay, fake ones, so to speak, that they're made by fermentation. Like I mentioned, chymosin. You want to make rennet. You want to make cheese. You use chymosin instead of making real rennet.
These are like vegetable sourced.
You missed it. They're made. I'll use the word artificially. They're made through a fermentation. It's called microbial. It's called microbial rennet. They program a yeast or a fungus to create the rennet that your stomach would have created. That the cow's stomach would have created. So,
All innocuous from kosher perspective.
no, it needs hashgacha, but nothing particularly sensitive like coming from a
Zero
cow.
connection to the cow.
I'll say yes. Okay, we can talk about it later. Okay, yeah, we'll say yes. Okay, yes, there's zero connection to a cow. Okay, yes, no connection to a cow. It's made by a yeast or a fungus. Okay, there's one hashkacha who actually makes them from animals. Okay, just for your curiosity, real Parmesan cheese that comes from the right place in Italy, that the real Parmesan cheese that comes from there, actually by law, just like it has to come from a certain place in Italy, it has to be made with animal rennet. Okay, so if you want to make kosher Parmesan cheese, that's the real stuff. I don't mean that was made in Wisconsin. I mean like the real stuff, the real Parmesan cheese. And there's another one. That stuff, I think it's called Parmesan Reggiano. It has some kind of whatever. Where you want to use that, you have to use animal rennet. And there's kosher versions of it. So there's this one hashkacha certifies rennet and lipase, both made. The lipase is actually made close by. The rennet and lipase made from animals that have shechita to them, kosher animals, and they make them and they consider them to be parav. Actually, one of them is sold mixed into milk powder, so it's sold as milchigs. Okay, it's sold as with a D on it. It's milchigs. Okay, so when you hear that, you say, "What in the world?" Okay, it's coming from an animal. The animal had shechita, and they do malicha to it, and they do menaka. They take out the fat, but the rennet is this chaylev there. They take out the fat and the chaylev, and they take out the dam, and they do shechita, and so a kosher animal. So not only sometimes it's par, half of them are par, and half of them are actually milchigs, literally milchigs. You say, what? It's coming from an animal. It's coming from a kosher animal. How in the world could it become par and milchigs?
Are you asking how can you make cheese that's possible called? Is that your question?
No, I'm not talking about that. That's the second. We'll get to that soon. The question.
Well, no, you are, because 1,000 years ago they didn't have.
I'm
From
gonna
the cow.
get.
Well,
I'm gonna
milk
get
is
that.
also not fleshy.
It's true, but this stuff. This is like.
No, there must be a way to do it. He's asking. There must be a way to do it.
Where I'm gonna get. All right.
No, but you said no.
I am.
Well, the par ones are what? Oh, they're not cheese.
The what?
What are they?
The lipase is a par, and they use it to put into butter or into.
Other things they're par.
What do you say?
They put into other things that are par.
No. I'm not talking what they put it into. I'm talking about it leaves the factory with a kosher logo on it that says that this thing is par. The people, as a rule, are going to use it to. I guess you could use it. Probably could dream of something to do with it. That's par. That's milk. Par also, but that's not no. People use it.
Are you saying that it's like it's part of the throat of?
I'm about to explain it. It is in the throat. No, it's in there. But the question I'm going to.
Okay, I guess I'll like.
I'm going to explain it. I'm going to explain to you now how they get it. But it's in there. Okay, don't worry, it's in there. Okay. So okay. Let's first talk about what do they do. So let's to understand what's going on here, and I'm going to try to explain to you what their position
So
is.
is this worse than kosher? I mean, the kosher powder of gelatin comes from animals.
It's an interesting question. How that's connected to gelatin? No, there's some. You'll hear maybe there's some similarities there. Maybe. Okay. So the what do they do? How do they get the stuff out? So what they do is they take the keva or the throat of the animal, and they do all the malicha and things like that to it. They cut it into tiny little pieces and they dunk it into a mixture of water and acid. And what happens is it breaks apart the meat. We'll call it meat. Okay, whatever they put into it, the actual pieces, literally pieces of meat that they put into it, it breaks it apart, and then they let it settle. And what happens is the sludge goes to the bottom, fat goes to the top, and in the middle, so vertically in the middle, you're left with this liquid. Okay, with a water, basically a water. Okay, and the enzyme is in that water. Okay, so they skim off the fat on the top, they get rid of the sludge on the bottom, and they suck out the water in the middle. Whichever way they do that, and then they filter and centrifuge a bunch of different times to separate the enzyme from the water. Okay, just for paying attention to this because it comes up in other things is that you can't heat it. Okay, you can't like spray dry this because if you heat it, you're going to kill the enzyme. Okay, the enzyme is a thing that heat is bad for it. So they will they will do different kinds of filtering and centrifuges and things like that, and then they either sell it as a liquid or they freeze dry it at very very low temperatures. Now, for most people, the actual enzyme itself, when you finish with the end, what you have left at the end is too small to work with, so they mix it with some other powder to go with, and that's why one of them is called milchigs because they mix it with milk powder. okay, but it's not inherently milk. They mix it with milk powder to sell it. Okay, was that confusing? Okay, so before we think about what's wrong with what they're doing, what the questions are, what they're doing is, like everybody said, is wait a second, 1,000 years ago, that's how everybody made cheese. You made it out of cane. So the Mechaber is like this. First of all, the Mechaber says there's such a thing. We know there's such a thing as what's called hamidou b'asavim. You can make cheese with asavim, okay, with grasses, okay. Exactly what grass is talking about, it's not so clear what it's talking about. In other words, the point is there are ways to get rennet from other places other than from the fourth stomach of a cow. Like there's a lot of work on trying to get that this maybe from figs, fishin or fitkin, however you pronounce that thing. Maybe that works to make cheese. There's whole piles of ideas of what things you could use alternates to stomachs in order to make cheese. So there's such a thing. Okay, there's such a thing as making cheese without animal. You need rennet, but you don't have to get rennet from a cow.
That's a different enzyme. That's not chymosin. You get it from the flowers. It doesn't work as good.
I know it doesn't work. So there's all kinds of work of people trying to find things that work. Those are peps instead of renins. They're a little bit different. They try to make things that are.
That's what I'm saying. Didn't they use from an animal? They did use from an animal.
I'm coming to that in 1 second. I'm coming to that 1 second. I just mentioned there's such a thing. You wonder how did they make cheese? There's such a thing as making cheese from asabim. Okay, from other plant material that has similar properties to rennet. Okay, so then there's two din that the Mechaber says and some peizayin. So one is over this: if you had keva that was dried out to the point that it's like a piece of wood, and you use that to make the cheese, and you took the stomach, you got it all dried out like a piece of wood, and use it, then the cheese is mutter. The Mechaber says, what happens if you have keva from an animal that was kosher but it was bata b'shishim? Okay, the amount of keva that you put in is very small. If you put in so little that it was bata b'shishim, the cheese is also kosher. Why? Hagam that the rennet is maimed the cheese. The rennet is maimed the cheese, but there's no issur of maimed from kosher meat to milk or kosher milk to meat. There's no din of maimed on something that's inherently kosher, and therefore the food wouldn't be mutter. The food wouldn't be usher. Sorry, wouldn't be usher. The cheese wouldn't be usher. Both of those things that I just told you are only b'di'evet. Okay, the price can say those are only b'di'evet. It's only b'di'evet if you use one that yavish ke'etz, and it's only b'di'evet if it was bata b'shishim. And the only time that's mutter lechatchila is if you have both together. Okay, it has to be bata b'shishim, which is not so hard, and yavish be'esh. If you have both of those together, then you're allowed to do lechatchila. But if not, it's only mutter b'di'evet. Okay. So the main question, okay, there are a lot of people ask a lot of questions on what this hashkacha does, but the main question they asked is that this stuff is not yavish ke'etz. Okay, it's not yavish ke'etz. If it's not yavish ke'etz, the whole possible heter is if it's bata b'shishim and yavish ke'etz, this stuff is not yavish ke'etz, and therefore it shouldn't be mutter. Okay, that's the main question that people ask of us. Okay, so this hashkacha relies to do what they do based on, I'll say 3 teshuvos, okay? 2 really, and 1 I'll get to later at the end. 2 teshuvos written by Rav Weisbandel. So it talks about different reasons why it should be mutter to what they do. And the teshuva is, I'm not telling you all the things that he rejects, okay? But the main thing that he's samech on, he says, is that it's not edible. Okay, this stuff, after it goes through this whole process I described to you, sitting in the acid, he says it's inherently it's not edible. But even without that, on top of that, they also put it through the acid, and they don't do anything to neutralize the acid, he says, and therefore it's inedible, and therefore it's okay. Okay, that's the main thing that he's samech on, to say that the reason why good. Other things that he's not so happy about, but that's the main thing he's being samech on. Okay, so you say, okay, no problem. Things that are not roy lachila are mutter. Okay, that's easy enough. We all know that things that are not roy lachila are mutter, so maybe that's a good answer. Okay, things not roy lachila, so that should be mutter. The problem is like this. Okay, the problem is like this. The Gemara says that sourdough is not edible. Sourdough is if you take dough and you let it sit for a day or so. What happens is the yeast keeps on expanding, and by a day later, that ball of dough will be super sour. Okay, it's because it's sour dough. It becomes very sour. The taste of the yeast makes it really sour. But now you got basically a ball of yeast. Okay, it has very concentrated yeast, and then you could use that to make your dough tomorrow. Okay, you could take that dough and put that into your flour tomorrow, and it'll help you make flour tomorrow. So so'ar is not roy lachila, but the Gemara says but the Torah says you're not allowed to keep Sa'ar on Pesach. Sa'ar is very chametzik. And the Gemara says because it's royal chamer but kam isas hacheres, it could use it to make other things chametz. So the Reb Chaim Ozer says that when the Gemara says that in royal chamer but isas hacheres is not a special din for chametz, it's not a special din for Pesach either. It's a general rule that when you have something which is not royal achila, but it's able to be used as a food ingredient, it's able to be used in making some other food, that in itself, that it could be used in other food, makes it royal achila. Because you can't eat it by itself. The Gemara says you can't eat black pepper either. Okay, so what? You can't eat black pepper. But black pepper is edible because you put black pepper into your challah. So it works, it's a food ingredient. So it's not inedible, it is edible. It's just you don't eat it straight. Okay, that's fine. That shouldn't make a difference. So he says that Gemara, what the pasuk is teaching us is that when you have something that's not edible, but it could be used as a food ingredient, that's still considered to be edible. So Sa'ar is a good example of that thing. Okay, so enzymes should be the same thing. The enzyme is not edible. Let's say it's inherently not edible. Let's say it's not edible because they added hydrochloric acid to it. Okay, it's not edible. So what? But it's very much a food ingredient. That's the whole point of it. You're going to use it to make cheese, or you're going to use it to make enzyme modified cheese, or you're going to make it to make cheese b'chlal. So then that should make it edible. Okay. So that's a question. How could you say inedible isn't good enough over here? Okay, because it really is edible because it's a food ingredient. Okay, but the truth is we really have to turn it around, which is how could Reb Chaim Ozer say? How could he say that being something that's used as a food ingredient is usher, is back to being considered edible? I just told you that the din is that dried out keva is you're allowed to use it to make cheese. Why allowed to use dried out keva? Because it's not edible. Well, isn't that the opposite of what he just said? Dried out keva, not edible, but dried out keva can make cheese, so it could use as a food ingredient. So what's the difference? If Sa'ar tells us that as long as it's a food ingredient, it's a problem. Then how is that different than dried out keva, where it's not?
Are you eating the keva itself, or eating that piece?
Are you eating the keva itself? So some people say that. I was going to say that later. Some people say that the difference is that the keva you put it into the cheese, but you take it out. Okay, that's an answer.
That would be a kasher on because he's saying you can use the gelatin. You're eating the gelatin.
Oh, don't talk about gelatin. Don't confuse us. He's already trying to confuse you with gelatin. The truth is actually it's not the gelatin truth, but so there are people who say that. I wasn't going to say that yet. I guess I had a time when I wanted to tell you that. But it's a question. Okay, you're giving me an answer. But the question is, how can you tell me that Sa'ar is special? Because Sa'ar teaches us that it's considered edible as long as you could use it as a food ingredient. When our cheese din is telling us that that's not true. Okay, so we didn't have to be the first to think about it. Reb Chaim asked the question on himself. He says, "Wait a second. How come dried out keva is okay?" And the Chazon Ish asked the question also. He says, how can I tell you that a food ingredient is usher no matter it's edible as long as it's a food ingredient when the din of keva says not like that? Okay, I'm going to tell you what they both of them answer. I'm going to try to tell you them. I can't say that both of them are so 100% clear. But I'll try to tell you what they are. Okay, Chaim says like this: when you have Sa'ar doing its job, helping make the food chametz, it's even though the Sa'ar is itself not edible, it's using a property that the dough had before it became inedible. It was dough that was rising and that was going to be able to ferment, and now you're using that same, you're continuing that same property and saying it was something that was rising, and I put into this food, and it continues to help the next thing rise. So even though it seems to be inedible, but I still see the original features that it had are still around, and therefore it's used as a food ingredient, and I still see the original dough that was here that was considered edible. And that's what works. As opposed to the keva is doing the trick, it's making cheese, but do I see any meat over here? I don't see any properties of the original meat passing through over here. The original meat was meat that tasted like a piece of meat, or whatever what it was. But that property is not what's coming through. It has this new property, which is it can help curdle milk and turn into cheese. Okay?
It's a chelik of the basar at this point.
That what?
But I think the enzymes in the basar.
So you're saying the basar itself could have done that. The meat itself would have done the trick.
This, as long as it's part of the basar, you can't break apart the basar and extract water from it and claim that this is not basar.
And therefore,
so this product is a chelik of the basar.
So you're saying is that I'm really seeing features of the meat coming through over here. Okay, so I think that he's looking at it.
Why are you not calling it meat? As I'm asking you.
Why am I not saying that this is meat?
That this enzyme is just this rennet is just meat.
It's a good question. I think that he's saying is that meat. The meat is it's kosher. Remember, it's kosher cave over here. So it's not carrying through the feature of the. No, I take that back if it's kosher. I take that back if it's kosher. It has to be kosher. But he says it's not carrying through. You're asking, the meat that was this meat had that feature, just like liver tastes like liver. This meat has this feature. Oh, that's a fair question. And Chazon Ish says an answer that's easier to understand. I'm still not 100%. Thank you. 100% that I understand that either. He says an afkamina is. He says that it's true as long as something is a food ingredient, it's still considered could be usher. He said, but there's a special din for basar b'chalav, that basar b'chalav is only usher as long as the basar gives tam into the chalav. There's no isser of, so to speak, of basar and chalav being mixed together if they don't give tam to each other. He says, so over here, there's no tam of basar. It has functionality, but doesn't have the time of basar. So let it be basar. If it would be isser, we have to say, oh, it's isser, so it's still considered edible. We say, okay, let it be edible. I don't care if it's edible, but it's edible that has no time of basar. Edible that time of basar doesn't make a problem. Doesn't look basar b'chalav. The basar b'chalav wise, which has to do with the gelatin, basar b'chalav wise doesn't make a difference. So let it be, so to speak, isser. But isser doesn't mean anything because there is no isser here. The only isser here is that it was fleishigs. Well, fleishigs mixed into milchigs is the only problem if it's nois and tam. It's not going to be nois and tam. Okay, that's easier to understand.
This is also only a problem with Nicer Time.
What do you say?
This is also only a problem with Nicer Time.
No, Isser is inherently problematic. Here, the basar doesn't become problematic until it mixes with chalav and starts giving time to each other. Okay, to the point that this Rabbi Kiva talks about. Maybe this is not bit this chatchil even. Maybe because there's no Isser here. So over here, the Isser doesn't start unless we have something that would be nice and tam. We've stripped all the time away from this thing, so it's automatically not going to be nice and tam. So nothing. It's not fleshing. Fleshing doesn't mean anything. Fleshing means I'm able to give time to something I can't give time. So okay. So now, both of those answers will tell us that being a dried out keva is not. The point is not that it's a dried out keva. Okay, it doesn't have to be dried out. If we make it into an inedible keva, it'll be mutter just as well. Okay, that'll be just do the trick also to make it mutter as an inedible keva, and it's not a kasher from zar. Zar is different. Most things are like zar, but when we're dealing with kosher meat, it had shrita and all the things. It's all completely kosher. We're just dealing with basar b'chalav. Then it's going to fit into that kula of of dried out keva, even though it's not actually a dried out keva, but it has the same effect. Instead, it would be a dried out keva. Okay. Now, before I go on, I'm so far telling you what the reason is why Rabbi Weissman was saying to be makel and why this hashgacha might want to be makel. I have more to say just for 1 minute. Just you should bear in mind that when the tshuva was publicized, before the tshuva was publicized, there were many people who disagree with him. When the tshuva was publicized, it was printed someplace. A whole bunch of people wrote tshuva saying we don't agree with this at all. Okay, so I'm only telling you one side of the story. There's a whole. I'm explaining to you one side of the story. There's lots of other people who had lots of things to say about them, including several who are quite prominent. Okay. Now, everything I told you, poor guy, he's going to miss the best part. Okay, not the best part, but and that is like this. All this would be an explanation for why Rabbi Weissman would say that it's mutter, except after some people. After Rabbi Weissman's first tshuva, when he explained why he thought it should be mutter, people had all kinds of questions. And I told you they wrote all kinds of tshuvas back against him. And he said like this. He said, me, I would never give a hechsher on this thing. I would never use this thing. I wouldn't dream of thinking that this thing should be kosher and parav. He says, but they asked me a shayla. They wanted to know, is it better to do it like this from a kosher cave or a kosher throat, or should I do it from nevela, or for one that didn't have malichan like that? So I explained all the reasons why it was better to do it this way. If you do it from kosher, it has all these advantages over doing it from treif. Okay, he says, I would never use it. That's how I know you guys who eat chavizol don't never use it. He says, I would never use this stuff. Okay, what? Well, whatever. It has to do with chavizol. Anyhow, so he says, we would never use this thing. Okay, we wouldn't dream of we would never use this thing. Okay. And also, there was an earlier tshuva from Ramosha when it was being made from nevelas. And Ramosha said, Ramosha told them, he says that I'm forgetting what I wanted to say. He said and Ramosha, when he wrote his tshuva to them, he had a bunch of conditions, which I don't understand how they thought they fulfill those conditions. But in the end, even after all his conditions, Ramosha said to him, "But don't use this with milk." Okay, so even he held that it wasn't a thing that should be used with milk, which of course is what you do with these things. You use it with milk. Okay, so what I'm saying to you is that Hagam, that I've told you a reason why, an explanation for why, or Rice Bonder was telling you why it should be okay, why it should be permitted to use this thing. He says he's not so thrilled himself with doing it, and here's what I was going to say from him is that there are other answers to explain the nafkamina between Sa'ar and Nisyabish Eish of a Keva, which would not make this mutter. Okay, there are other ways to answering that question. I told you where Chaim Moses has them or Chazon has, which are both fine, good answers. I'm not taking away from them. I would say, but there are other answers, and that might in itself be why Rabbi Weissman himself is not so excited. Was not so excited about it. Okay, so now just before we hand off, and I'm handing off on a negative sense, just remember that being as it's made from kosher animals, and the animals had malicha and everything, the enzyme is completely kosher. The food that's made with it is for sure okay, because remember the Mechaber says b'diavad, if you made it from the keva and it was bottle, there's no din of maimed on it. Okay, there's no din of maimed on these things because it's kosher. Kosher at the worst, it's kosher meat going into milk, so it's kosher. So it's din Davar Hama'amid. Okay, so we're good. B'diavad, this stuff is okay. The question is just, is it right to call it parav or call it milchig or use it in a kosher thing? But the other thing that we made, we're going to be safe in the end thing. Okay, so that's the good news, if you want to call it that. So I was going to tell you, I'm not going to
Water
do.
also?
It's going to be bat b'shishim. Yeah, I just assume, I don't know, but I'm just assuming that it's bat b'shishim. How much do you think you use in this stuff? I don't know. I'm just assuming it's an enzyme. It's used in tiny amounts. What? So the footnote about Avila Taimam and Davar Hama'amid are very intertwined with each other. This type of Avila Taimam, it's not Avila Taimam. You don't taste the enzyme. The enzyme has an effect on the taste of the food. You don't taste that thing, and that, which is, we call that Avila Taimam Darbanon and Davar Hama'amid, are very intertwined with each other, and seemingly they have the same rules. Okay, that might work for Het. That's a question. I was going to tell you, I'm not just going to run through it just for whatever it's worth. I was going to sit with it on a few minutes. I don't have time. And that is, are these things, if they use b'diavad, are these enzymes, remember I told you 8 enzymes? Are they Davar Hama'amid? Is it considered b'diavad Davar Hama'amid? So amylases usually are, not always, but usually they are. Usually they consider Davar Hama'amid. They make a bland tasting thing to something sweet. Dextrinase usually is not a Davar Hama'amid. It's a Pesach question usually. Glucosamidase is not, because it's an immobilized enzyme. It doesn't stay in the food. It just sits there. And so it's not Davar Hama'amid because of that. Lactase doesn't have such a big effect. To make sweet or drop sweet, it doesn't make sure not a Davar Hama'amid. Lipase usually is a Davar Hama'amid. Papain is not. It's, again, a minor effect. And pectinase also just doesn't have any significant effect to be considered Davar Hama'amid. And then, of course, it's a classic of Davar Hama'amid is actually, that's what we learned it in from, is